Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. It's almost like mechanical engineering.
Right, yeah, like fixing a car.
Exactly. You fall off a ladder, your arm swells up, the
Yeah.
doctor takes an x-ray, and, well, there it is, that jagged white line right across the bone. The doctor just points to the screen and says, you know, there's the break.
And that is incredibly comforting. I mean, we have this deep-seated psychological need for things to be visible, right? To be categorized, broken or not broken, sick or healthy.
Yeah, but then you step out of the hospital and back into the real world. You step into the realm of human behavior.
Which is a lot messier.
Oh, completely messy. It's the way we treat each other, the way we justify our actions. And suddenly that x-ray machine is, it's utterly useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is honestly just completely murky.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Have you ever wondered what you actually mean when you say an action is wrong? Just think about it. It's not a fact about the physical world that you can, like, measure with a ruler.
No, you can't put wrongness in a test tube.
Right. And it's not just a fleeting feeling in your stomach either, because we argue about it. We demand that other people agree with us.
Yeah.
So what exactly is it? Okay, let's unpack this.
What's fascinating here is that the answer to that question isn't just some academic puzzle. I mean, it might fundamentally change how you interact with every single person in your life.
From your spouse to your coworkers to a complete stranger you accidentally cut off in traffic.
Exactly. So today we are doing a deep dive into a really monumental framework built by the philosopher T.M. Scanlon. This is from his 1998 book, What We Owe to Each Other.
And we aren't going to read this like a dry syllabus. We're going to use Scanlon's architecture to kind of hack the way you justify your own life choices.
But to do that, we have to narrow our focus a bit. Scanlon does something incredibly ambitious, but he starts by shrinking the target.
Right, he isolates things.
Yeah, he wants to isolate the exact nature of morality, but specifically a very tight, crucial domain of it. He separates what we might call broad morality, things like personal virtues, or what makes a life generally good.
Or like what makes a beautiful piece of art.
Exactly, broad stuff. He separates that from the strict domain of what we owe to each other. This is the domain of our duties to other people. It's about avoiding harm, keeping promises, the absolute baseline requirements of living in a shared space.
Which is, I mean, a paradigm shift all on its own. We so often conflate being a good person with doing the right thing.
Right, and Scanlon tells us that the domain of what we owe each other is governed by a theory called contractualism. And if you remember one phrase from this entire deep dive, let it be this. Contractualism is the idea that morality is fundamentally about acting on principles that others could not reasonably reject.
Okay, reasonably reject. Not what they would actively accept, but what they couldn't reasonably
Right,
reject.
that's the core of it, yes.
We are going to get deeply into the mechanics of what that looks like in the real world. And to you, listening right now, consider yourself the third person in the room with us. We're taking you on a rigorous journey through human obligations.
But before we can even figure out what makes an action wrong or what someone might reasonably reject, we really have to understand the machinery of human motivation.
Why we do anything at all.
Exactly. We have to start with the absolute foundation of thought, which is reasons.
And this is where Scanlon just throws a wrench into classical psychology. He starts with a really bold claim. He takes the concept of a reason as primitive. It's the bedrock.
Right. He says a reason is simply a consideration that counts in favor of something, and he refuses to reduce it to anything else.
Which goes against the grain, because for a long time in philosophy and honestly in everyday conversation, people have tried to explain reasons by pointing to desires.
Yeah, the classic view, the Humanian view of motivation, is pretty straightforward. It says you have a biological or psychological desire for food, and that blind desire is the engine. It gives you a reason to eat.
But Scanlon flips this completely upside down, right?
He really does. He argues that the notion of a desire, if it's actually going to explain anything about our actions, has to be understood in terms of reasons,
Yeah.
not the other way around.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate here, though.
Yeah.
If I haven't eaten in 12 hours, I feel a physical gnawing in my stomach. That is a desire for food.
Sure.
I am not sitting there having a philosophical debate with myself about the considerations counting in favor of a sandwich. I just want the sandwich. So doesn't the desire come first?
Well, the physical sensation comes first, yes. But Scanlon makes a crucial distinction between a mere urge and a directed action. You don't walk to the fridge and make a sandwich just because a blind physical urge pushes your limbs around like a marionette.
Okay, that's true. I have to physically choose to make it.
Right. You eat because you recognize that the physical depletion, that gnawing feeling, is a consideration that counts in favor of eating.
Oh, I see.
You might also recognize the pleasure of the meal as a reason. Desires, in the way they actually drive complex human behavior, are based on taking things to be reasons.
I see the distinction. It's the difference between, like, a reflex and a choice.
Hmm.
Which brings us to a concept he introduces called judgment-sensitive attitudes.
That's a key term.
Yeah, we have to separate mere feelings from attitudes for which reasons can be demanded. Think about it like driving a car. Your control of the steering wheel, hitting the brakes, accelerating that, is based on judgment-sensitive attitudes.
You're steering based on the information you're getting.
Exactly. You see a stop sign. Your brain processes that as a reason, and you step on the brake. You see a pedestrian step into the crosswalk, you swerve. If a police officer pulls you over, you can actually be asked to justify why you turned the wheel.
And you contrast that with the weather hitting the windshield.
Right. The rain hitting the glass, or a rock flying up and cracking the windshield that just happens to you. You can't be asked to justify why a rock hit your car.
No, that would be absurd.
Exactly. In our bodies, a mere feeling is like the weather. You are physically fatigued or your stomach is growling. But a judgment-sensitive attitude is the steering wheel. You can absolutely be asked to justify a belief, an intention, or a fear.
Building on that analogy, if an ideally rational person forms a judgment-sensitive attitude, they do it because they judge there to be sufficient reasons for it.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, if I hold the belief that a nearby volcano is going to erupt and I form an intention to evacuate, those are judgment-sensitive.
Because you have reasons,
Right.
seismograph data, whatever.
Exactly. But if a team of geologists then proves to me that the volcano is dormant, my reasons are shown to be false. Consequently, my fear and my intention to flee should just extinguish.
So the reasons are gone.
Right. This capacity to recognize and respond to reasons is the absolute core of human agency. If we don't understand this, we cannot even begin to talk about moral responsibility.
Because you can't hold someone morally responsible for the weather. You can only hold them responsible for how they steer the car.
Spot on.
But that raises a massive question about rationality. We throw the word irrational around all the time. Someone buys a ridiculously expensive car they can't afford. We call them irrational.
We do, but Scanlon defines irrationality very, very narrowly.
Like how narrowly?
For Scanlon, irrationality is not just making a mistake or doing something foolish. Irrationality is a direct internal clash within your own judgments. It's a failure of your own internal wiring.
So it's knowing better, but doing it anyway.
Yes, it's when you judge with full clarity that you have a compelling reason to avoid something, but you still do it anyway.
He uses this famously wild thought experiment from the philosopher Derek Parfit to illustrate this, right? The future Tuesday indifference.
Yeah, philosophers love these extremes because they isolate the mechanism.
Okay, so imagine a person who cares deeply about avoiding future pain. If you tell him he's going to need a brutal, unanesthetized root canal on Monday, he dreads it. He will pay any amount of money to avoid it.
As anyone would.
Right. If you schedule it for Wednesday, same thing. He is terrified. But for some completely inexplicable reason, he simply does not care about any excruciating pain if it happens to fall on a Tuesday. He's totally indifferent.
It's such a bizarre scenario.
It really is. I mean, any normal person would look at that guy and say, he is completely irrational. But Scanlon says, wait, under his strict definition, this guy isn't necessarily irrational.
Because there's no internal clash?
Exactly. If the guy genuinely does not see Tuesday pain as a reason to care, if his brain literally just doesn't register it as negative consideration, he's not experiencing an internal contradiction.
He isn't sitting there saying, I know I have a compelling reason to avoid this Tuesday root canal, but I'm going to ignore my own judgment.
Right. He just has a massive, inexplicable blind spot.
And the crucial takeaway there is that the man is substantively mistaken about what reasons he has. Obviously, pain is bad, regardless of the day of the week.
Obviously.
But he isn't strictly irrational unless he acknowledges the reason and then his attitudes fail to fall in line. We can bring in Philippa Foot's concept of the cool, calculating man to ground this in something a bit more sinister.
Oh, right, the sociopath archetype.
Precisely. Imagine someone who perfectly understands the consequences of his actions. He feels no internal contradiction. He chooses to act purely in his own financial self-interest at the expense of everyone around him without a single shred of empathy.
He defrauds the elderly, ruins businesses, and sleeps like a baby.
Yeah. Is he irrational?
I mean, I want to say yes just to condemn him.
Yeah.
It feels good to call him irrational.
We all do. But by Scanlon's narrow definition, no. His actions align perfectly with the deeply selfish reasons he chooses to recognize.
So he's not broken inside in that structural sense.
Right. But he is profoundly morally mistaken. He's failing to see the force of reasons that he ought to see, namely, the well-being and rights of others.
That distinction is tough, but it forces us to do the hard work. We shouldn't use the word irrational as a lazy catch-all for doing things we think are wrong. It forces us to actually explain why someone's reasons are morally mistaken.
Exactly. It demands more rigor from us.
Okay, so if we accept that we are creatures driven by reasons, we have to look at how those reasons aggregate. How do the signs we read on the road turn into a destination?
Because normally when we talk about valuing something, we assume it means we want to maximize it.
Right. If money is valuable, more money is better. If happiness is valuable, a higher quantity of happiness is better. It's a numbers game.
This is the view philosophers call teleology, the idea that to value something is always and only to promote it, to try to bring more of it into existence.
But Scanlon argues this is a massive misunderstanding of how human beings actually experience value.
A complete misunderstanding.
Let's look at the value of human life. If teleology were true, valuing human life would mean your primary overriding goal is to maximize the sheer number of biological humans on the planet.
You'd be morally obligated to spend every waking moment trying to increase the global birth rate, or, I don't know, cloning people.
Which is an absurd conclusion. That's not what valuing human life actually means.
Yeah.
Valuing human life means treating the individuals who already exist with respect.
Right. It means not harming them, recognizing their autonomy, ensuring their dignity.
So the reasons generated by the value of human life are reasons of respect, not reasons of promotion.
Yes. And he takes this critique even further by attacking something that is practically a religion in modern society, the idea of a master value.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
A lot of moral theories, specifically utilitarianism and almost all of modern economics, operate on the assumption that well-being is the ultimate scoreboard of life.
Like it's a video game, and well-being is your high score.
Exactly. They treat well-being as this independent, quantifiable substance. Everything else we value, art, friendship, a fulfilling career, physical health, is just a token you drop into the well-being meter to make your score go up.
But Scanlon completely rejects this master value myth. He argues that well-being is not a separate thing you can measure independently of the specific goals and values a person actually holds.
He calls it an inclusive good.
What does that mean practically?
It means if you succeed in your worthwhile goals, your life goes better. But you don't pursue those goals because they produce an abstract substance called well-being. You pursue them because the goals themselves are inherently worthwhile.
But wait, let me push back on that because I think a lot of listeners might feel this is just a semantic trick.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I spend years mastering the piano because I value art, and as a result my life feels incredibly rich and fulfilling, haven't I just maximized my well-being? Why is Scanlon splitting hairs over whether well-being is a master value or an inclusive good?
It's not just semantics, I promise. It fundamentally changes how you make choices.
How so?
Think about the modern obsession with tracking every metric of our lives. We have rings for sleep, apps for productivity, mood trackers. Hustle culture tells us to optimize every waking hour to maximize our personal utility.
Guilty as charged.
Right, we all do it. But if well-being is a master value, then your piano playing is only valuable so long as it yields the highest emotional return on investment.
Oh, I see where this is going.
The second a different hobby promises a slightly higher dopamine hit, the master value theory says you should abandon the piano. But that betrays what it actually means to value music.
Because you play the piano, because you are responding to the reasons generated by the music itself. The fulfillment is just a byproduct, not the actual target.
Exactly. That distinction really crystallizes when he critiques standardized measures of well-being. We all know John Rawls' primary social goods, things like income, wealth, basic liberties.
And Amartya Sen's capability sets,
Yeah.
measuring whether a person has basic capabilities to participate in society.
Right. Now, Scanlon acknowledges those are brilliant tools for political philosophy. If you're a government trying to figure out if you're distributing resources fairly, you absolutely need those metrics.
But from a first-person individual perspective, they are terrible tools for measuring your actual lived experience.
All right.
You might have a high income and full basic liberties, and your life might still feel hollow and terrible. Conversely, your life might be profoundly meaningful in terms of your specific artistic or spiritual pursuits, even if you ranked really low on those political metrics.
Because well-being is far too complex and far too deeply tied to our specific individual reasons to be captured by a single universal scoreboard.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's test this against something deeply personal, like friendship.
A perfect test case.
If you truly value a friendship, what is your primary reason for action? It's to be a good, loyal friend to the specific person you care about. You support them, you keep their secrets, you sit with them in the hospital.
You're focused on them as a person?
Exactly. Now, imagine a scenario where betraying your best friend, just completely ruining that relationship, would somehow magically create 3 new, equally good friendships in the world.
Oh, wow. A pure teleologist, a pure maximizer, would look at that math and say, well, 3 is greater than 1. The master value of well-being demands we maximize friendships, betray the friend.
Which is repulsive.
Completely repulsive.
Anyone who understands the value of friendship knows that to make that trade would be to fundamentally misunderstand what a friend actually is. The reasons that flow from the value of friendship are reasons of loyalty, partiality, and specific connection.
They are not reasons of global maximization.
Right. And this framework also perfectly explains the concept of sacrifice. Think about waking up at 5 a.m. to go for a run in the freezing cold. You are giving up the immediate comfort of a warm bed.
If you were just consulting a real-time well-being meter, you'd never get out of bed.
Never. But you do it because you value your long-term health, or perhaps the discipline itself. The feeling of sacrifice is entirely real. You have genuinely given up something. You had a valid reason to want sleep for the sake of another value you judge to be more important.
We navigate life by responding to a rich tapestry of specific values, not by constantly doing a generalized calculus of our total utility.
Okay, so we aren't just maximizing a scoreboard. We process reasons, and we respond to specific values. But here is the inevitable friction: my values are going to collide with your values.
Always.
My deep desire to learn the drums at midnight collides with your deep value of getting a good night's sleep. If there's no master scoreboard to consult to see who wins, how do we know who is actually wrong?
To answer this, Scanlon has to tackle a foundational philosophical problem known as Pritchard's dilemma, named after H.A. Pritchard.
Okay, what's the dilemma?
It asks a seemingly simple question. Why be moral?
That seems like a big question.
It is. If I ask you why I shouldn't play the drums at midnight, and you say, because the neighborhood association will fine you, then my motivation to stop isn't moral. It's purely selfish risk management, fear of a penalty.
But if you answer, you shouldn't play the drums because it's wrong, then you haven't actually answered the question. You're just talking in a circle. Do it because you should do it.
Exactly the trap. It's a tautology. So Scanlon needs a way out. He needs to explain the motivation for morality in a way that isn't just selfish risk management, but also isn't a circular tautology.
What's his answer?
It's profound. He argues that humans are deeply fundamentally motivated by the desire to live in a state of mutual recognition with others. We inherently want our actions to be justifiable to the people around us.
And that leads directly back to the contractualist formula. I'll say it again. An act is wrong if it would be disallowed by any principle that others could not reasonably reject.
Notice the phrasing there. He doesn't say we look for principles everyone would accept.
Because that's impossible. If we wait for everyone to actively accept a rule, we'd have anarchy.
Right. It's about finding rules that no one has a valid, reasonable complaint against.
But who gets a seat at this negotiating table? Does my golden retriever get a say? Do the redwoods in California get a say?
That's the scope of morality question. Scanlon maps it out very carefully. He looks at things that just have a good, like a plant that can thrive or wither.
Okay.
Then he looks at conscious beings that feel pain. Then, beings with judgment-sensitive attitudes. Ultimately, he argues this core morality of what we owe to each other applies to all actual beings who do have or will exist, who are capable of holding judgment-sensitive attitudes.
Which means this specific domain of morality is about creatures you can stand in a relation of mutual justification with.
Yes. Now, this doesn't mean you can go out and torture animals or burn down forests.
Right. Scanlon absolutely acknowledges there are other moral reasons not to do those things.
Exactly. But the specific wrongness of violating what we owe to each other, that pain of breaking the social contract, applies to rational creatures capable of being wronged in this specific, justificatory way.
To make this visceral, he brings up a powerful historical example. He points to the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the era of the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War protests.
It's a striking example.
He uses this massive cultural shock to show what happens when a society suddenly realizes that its institutions are fundamentally unjustifiable to others.
In the 1950s, a large portion of white America lived with the comfortable illusion that their society was basically fair. They believed the rules were principles no one could reasonably reject.
But when the civil rights movement forced the brutal realities of systemic racism into the light, and the anti-war movement exposed the realities of Vietnam, that illusion was violently shattered.
And the reaction to that shattering wasn't just like an academic debate about legal codes.
No, it was chaos.
The deep pain, the protests in the streets, the tearing apart of families at the dinner table, it was a visceral psychological reaction to the loss of being in unity with our fellow creatures.
People felt the pain of estrangement. They realized that the terms of their society were terms that minorities and the global poor could absolutely reasonably reject.
And that pain of moral guilt is unique. It's not just a fear of getting caught or going to jail. It is the pain of realizing you are disconnected from the community of humanity because your actions, or the actions done in your name, cannot be justified.
We deeply want our lives to be justifiable. When we realize they aren't, it creates a profound psychological rupture.
Let's bring that down to an intensely personal level with the kidney theft example.
Oh, this one is wild.
Imagine you have a friend who desperately needs a kidney transplant. You happen to be a match, and you have 2 healthy kidneys. One night, while you're sleeping, your friend has the opportunity to drug you, perform a pristine back alley surgery, and steal your kidney.
Okay, horrible, but go on.
But they don't do it. The next morning, over coffee, they casually tell you, I thought about stealing your kidney last night. I had the chloroform ready, but I didn't do it only because I happened to really enjoy our conversations about baseball.
It's a terrifying realization. I mean, think about that. To you, the listener, how would you feel if someone's only reason for not mutilating your body was a passing whim?
It's chilling.
If they didn't refrain because they respect your bodily autonomy as a universal moral rule, but just because you're currently entertaining to them, it is deeply unsettling. Friendship requires a baseline of moral standing.
We need to know that people recognize our rights independently of their affection for us. We need them to act on principles they couldn't reasonably reject, like don't harvest people's organs.
That horror you feel in the kidney scenario is the realization that the other person does not recognize your basic moral standing. They aren't playing the game of mutual justification.
No, they're just operating on their own subjective desires, and you happen to be lucky enough to align with those desires today. Tomorrow, you might not be so lucky.
Okay, so I get the theory. We need principles no one can reasonably reject. But in the real world, people reject things unreasonably all the time.
Oh, constantly.
People are selfish, they are stubborn, they are biased. If we are trying to build a framework for society, how do we actually figure out what a reasonable rejection is without creating a total gridlock where someone always objects?
To understand Scanlon's solution, we have to look at how he contrasts contractualism with the 2 other massive philosophical theories that try to solve this.
Okay.
We all know the standard utilitarian calculus, you maximize aggregate utility. If harvesting 1 healthy person's organs can save 5 dying people, pure utilitarianism says you do it because 5 lives outweigh 1.
It just steamrolls the individual.
Right, and we all know John Rawls tried to solve that steamrolling with his famous veil of ignorance. Rawls argued we should choose the rules of society while pretending we don't know who we're going to be, rich or poor, healthy or sick, majority or minority.
Rawls' approach is brilliant for designing fair political institutions.
It is, but Scanlon thinks Rawls goes too far by stripping away our identities. In contractualism, we don't have to put on a blindfold. We know exactly who we are, what our interests are, and what our specific burdens are.
But we seek principles that anyone similarly motivated to find agreement could accept. And we do this by looking at what he calls generic reasons.
This is the crux of it, generic reasons.
Explain how that avoids the gridlock.
Well, we don't evaluate rules by looking at the hyper-specific complaints of an individual named John, who has a very specific, quirky set of desires. We look at generic reasons based on standpoints.
Standpoints.
Yeah. For example, in a debate about rules for mutual aid, there is the standpoint of someone who desperately needs life-saving help. And there's the standpoint of someone who's being asked to sacrifice their time and resources to give that help.
So we evaluate principles by comparing the generic burdens attached to these standpoints.
Exactly.
It makes me think of a group of roommates trying to agree on a chore wheel.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
If you used utilitarianism, the 3 messy roommates might just vote to make the one neat freak do all the cleaning. The aggregate happiness of the 3 lazy roommates outweighs the misery of the 1 neat roommate. That's obviously unfair.
Very unfair.
But you also can't make a chore rule by putting on a veil of ignorance and pretending you don't know who lives in the apartment. You do know.
You know exactly who is messy.
Right. So you have to find a rule that no roommate, regardless of their personal cleaning preferences, can reasonably call unfair. You look at the generic burden of living in filth versus the generic burden of spending 20 minutes sweeping the floor.
That's a perfect microcosm, and it leads to a vital question in this weighing of generic reasons. Does the worst-off person always get priority?
In the chore wheel, does the messiest person, or the neatest person, automatically get veto power?
Scanlon argues no. Priority is not global. It depends entirely on the specific aspect of welfare being affected by the principle.
He illustrates this with the fortunate Joneses, right?
Yes, the Joneses. Imagine a wealthy, incredibly secure family. They live in a jaded compound. They have private medical staff. They travel in armored cars.
They are set.
They know, with almost absolute certainty, that they will never, ever need emergency aid from a stranger. So society proposes a principle of mutual aid, a rule saying you must help people in life-threatening emergencies if it's not a huge risk to yourself.
And the Joneses raise their hands and say, "We reject this principle. It imposes a burden on us to help others, and we will never benefit from it. We reject it."
But under Scanlon's framework, the Joneses' rejection is unreasonable.
Because in contractualism, you cannot rely on your specific, extraordinarily lucky circumstances to veto a rule.
Exactly. You have to compare the generic burdens. You weigh the generic burden of needing life-saving aid and being ignored against the generic inconvenience of pulling your car over to help someone.
And the burden of being left to die is vastly, infinitely heavier than the burden of giving help.
Therefore, the Joneses cannot reasonably reject the principle, even if it happens to be a bad deal for them personally.
You can see the modern corollaries everywhere. Think about the debate over taxing billionaires to fund universal health care, or wealthy neighborhoods fighting affordable housing zoning laws. The argument is often, this burdens me and doesn't benefit me.
And Scanlon provides the architecture to say, yes, it burdens you, but your rejection is unreasonable because the generic standpoint of lacking basic healthcare or shelter vastly outweighs your generic standpoint of slightly reduced wealth.
And this framework also solves a massive problem that Immanuel Kant ran into.
Oh, the Kantian issue, yes.
Kant proposed the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, as the basis of morality. But critics quickly pointed out that the golden rule fails when you apply it to a judge sentencing a criminal.
Because the criminal can look at the judge and say, hey, if you were in my shoes, you wouldn't want to go to jail. So by the golden rule, you can't send me to jail.
Subjective desires just break the system.
Precisely. Contractualism solves this by looking at general principles of action, not subjective wants. The criminal obviously doesn't want to go to jail, but the criminal cannot reasonably reject a general societal principle that punishes harmful crimes.
Why not?
Because the generic reasons of the victims, their need for safety and justice, and society's need for stability, drastically outweigh the criminal's desire to avoid the consequences of their actions. Fairness operates independently of just maximizing what people want.
Okay, so we've got our principles. We can navigate the gridlock using generic reasons. But let's face reality, people fail. People act selfishly, they make mistakes, they break the rules. How does contractualism handle the messiness of actual human failure?
This is where Scanlon introduces the 2 faces of responsibility, and it might be the most empathetic part of the entire book.
He points out that when we argue about whether someone is responsible for something, we are almost always conflating 2 completely different concepts.
He separates them into responsibility as attributability and substantive responsibility.
Let's start with attributability. This asks, can this action be attributed to you for moral appraisal? Does this action reflect your judgment-sensitive attitudes?
Right. If you lie to a friend to save yourself some mild embarrassment, we attribute that lie to you. We blame you for it because it reflects your flawed moral judgment at that moment.
But then there's substantive responsibility. And this is entirely different. This is about bearing the actual costs of your choices.
Give an example.
Like, if you decide to take your entire life savings and invest it in a highly volatile cryptocurrency and the market crashes, it is your substantive responsibility. You have to bear the financial cost. Society doesn't owe you a bailout.
And the reason substantive responsibility matters so much is because of what Scanlon calls the value of choice. We actually want substantive responsibility.
Right, we do.
Think about picking out furniture for your living room or choosing a career path. Even if a super intelligent AI could scan your posture and objectively pick a more ergonomic sofa, or an algorithm could perfectly match you to a low-stress job, you would still want to make the choice yourself.
Yeah, I definitely would.
We want the world we live in to be a product of our own agency, our imagination, and our tastes. Because we value that choice, we accept the flip side. We bear the substantive responsibility when we pick an ugly sofa or a stressful job.
The friction arises when these two types of responsibility get tangled up. Scanlon strictly rejects what he calls the forfeiture view.
The forfeiture view is this incredibly harsh, punitive idea that if you make a bad choice, you simply forfeit your moral rights. You deserve whatever suffering comes your way. It's the societal attitude of, you made your bed, now lie in it.
To make this concrete, let's look at an example from the philosopher Susan Wolf, which Scanlon references: the uncaring friend.
Oh, this is a tough one.
Imagine a woman whose friend is moving across town and desperately needs help. This woman refuses to help. It's not that she's busy with a medical emergency. She literally just does not see her friend's need as a valid reason to lift a finger. She's entirely self-centered. Now, let's add a twist. Let's assume we find out she was raised in a deeply neglectful, terrible environment that completely stunted her emotional growth. She couldn't help the psychological upbringing that forged her into this selfish person. How can we blame her?
The forfeiture view short-circuits here. It demands we either completely excuse her or completely condemn her. But Scanlon's system splits the difference beautifully.
How does he split it?
On the level of attributability, yes, we absolutely attribute moral blame to her. Even if she didn't choose her tragic childhood, her action right now reflects her actual, current, flawed judgment of reasons. She genuinely believes she has no reason to help a struggling friend.
That is a moral fault.
Yes, her attitude damages the relationship, and it is appropriate to criticize her.
But on the level of substantive responsibility, things change. Think about a time you made a terrible mistake. Really think about it. When you made a bad call that hurt someone, did you suddenly deserve to lose all your fundamental human rights?
Did you forfeit your right to be treated with basic dignity?
Or did you just have to bear the specific cost of fixing the mistake and making amends?
Scanlon is saying that just because we attribute a moral failing to someone, it does not mean they lose their moral standing in the universe. The correct contractualist response when we see someone suffer for a bad choice isn't to wash our hands of them.
The response should be a recognition of our shared vulnerability. It's the attitude of, there but for the grace of God go I.
Exactly. We might still require them to bear the costs. If you gamble your money away, the state might not replace it, but we do not strip them of their humanity or their right to baseline respect.
It's a profoundly empathetic way of looking at human frailty. Now, if choice creates substantive responsibility, the ultimate, most distilled version of this is a promise.
Yes, promising.
A promise is a voluntary choice to bind yourself to an obligation. But why exactly is breaking a promise wrong?
Historically, philosophical heavyweights like David Hume and John Rawls argued for what we call an institutional view of promising.
The institutional view.
They argued that promising is essentially a social practice. It's a tool, like a game we all invented, to make society run smoother. Therefore, breaking a promise is wrong because it's free riding on a social good. You are taking advantage of a useful societal system without doing your part to maintain it.
But Scanlon says that feels way too sterile. The wrongness of breaking a promise isn't about damaging some abstract societal institution. It's much more intimate and, frankly, much more manipulative than that.
It's about deliberately creating expectations and leaving a specific person vulnerable. He introduces what he calls Principle F, the principle of fidelity.
Principle F states that if you intentionally lead someone to form an expectation about your future behavior, and you know they're going to rely on that expectation, you have a moral obligation not to disappoint them without sufficient justification.
Let's strip away all of society to see if this holds up. He uses the example of a boomerang in the state of nature.
The state of nature, okay, no laws.
Right. Imagine you and I are two early humans. There are no laws, no courts, no concept of a social contract or a practice of promising. We don't even share a language. I have your spear and you have my boomerang. We are standing across a river from each other.
Setting the scene.
I hold up your spear and point to my boomerang. You nod. You throw my boomerang across the river to me. I pick it up and then I just turn around and run away into the jungle with both weapons.
Under the institutional view, It's actually hard to explain exactly why that is a moral wrong, since there is no social practice of promising established yet in this state of nature.
But under Principle F, the wrongness is glaringly obvious. You intentionally manipulated my psychology. You created a false expectation in my mind specifically to benefit yourself, and you left me vulnerable and disarmed.
You have committed a profound moral wrong against me as an individual, entirely independent of any societal rules.
Exactly. So what does this all mean? It means Scanlon's view of promises is like holding someone over a ledge. You invited them to step out into thin air and trust your grip. You can't just open your hand, let them fall, and say, well, I never signed a legally binding contract.
It's about the morality of vulnerability.
And this brings us to the value of assurance, which Scanlon illustrates with the story of Harold in Chicago.
Oh, poor Harold.
Suppose you are at a crowded party with your friend Harold. Harold pulls you aside, looking terrified. He says, please, promise me you won't tell that embarrassing story about me in Chicago to anyone here. You promise.
And then,
For 15 weeks after that party, Harold sleeps soundly, enjoying total peace of mind. Then, on the very last day of a group vacation, 15 weeks later, you stand up in front of everyone and tell the Chicago story.
oh, that is brutal. To update that for today, it's like someone sending you a deeply personal text message in confidence, and 15 weeks later, you take a screenshot and post it on social media.
Exactly the same mechanism. Now, a strict utilitarian might look at that scenario and say, well, mathematically, you maximized Harold's peace of mind for 15 solid weeks. The 5 minutes of embarrassment at the end is outweighed by the massive utility of those weeks of calm.
But that completely misunderstands the psychology of a promise. The value assurance isn't just an experiential feeling of calm like taking a sedative. It's the right to rely on the actual objective outcome.
Harold didn't ask you to hypnotize him into feeling safe. He asked for the reality of your silence.
By breaking the promise, you proved that his 15 weeks of peace were an illusion based on a lie. The assurance is destroyed retroactively.
Which highlights how crucial belief is to this whole equation. Consider the Proflick Powell scenario.
The friend who never pays you back.
Right. You have a friend who constantly begs for money and never ever pays it back. He comes to you in tears, begging for a loan, making solemn promises to repay you next Tuesday. You feel pity for him.
You know with 100% certainty he will never pay you back.
But you hand him the money anyway, and you say, okay, I'm holding you to your promise. Does he have a promissory obligation to repay you?
It seems like he should, right? He said the magic words.
But Scanlon says no, he does not have a promissory obligation.
Wait, really? Why not?
Because Principle F requires you, the lender, to actually believe and rely on his assurance. If you don't believe him, your psychology hasn't been manipulated. He didn't trick you into vulnerability. You walked into it with your eyes wide open.
Wow. So Scanlon says the profligate pal still owes you, but he owes you a debt of gratitude for your charity, not an obligation of fidelity to a promise.
The mechanism of a promise isn't a magic spell you cast by saying, I promise. It is the real-world creation of vulnerability in another human mind. If the mind isn't vulnerable, the promise didn't take root.
Okay, we've covered an immense amount of ground. We've built this incredibly robust, almost airtight system of what we owe to each other. We've grounded it in reasons, refined it with generic standpoints, and applied it to responsibility and promises.
But there's a big counter-argument waiting.
Right. I can hear the ultimate counter-argument brewing. What happens when we step outside our own cultural bubble? What happens when we travel across the globe or even just look at a different subculture online and encounter people who completely, fundamentally disagree with our moral rules? Does contractualism survive relativism?
It is the ultimate stress test for any moral theory. Scanlon acknowledges right out of the gate that what is considered right or wrong in a practical day-to-day sense can and does vary based on local circumstances.
But, and this is the linchpin of his defense, he argues that the underlying principle of reasonable rejection remains completely objective.
To explain this, he draws on the political philosopher Michael Walzer's concept of social meanings. The idea is that the meaning of an action changes depending on the culture, which means the generic reasons people have to reject a principle will also change.
Let's use privacy as an example. Imagine two different cultures. In culture A, it is deeply, profoundly humiliating to have your personal financial information known by your neighbors. It causes genuine social ostracization, psychological distress, and ruins reputations.
And in culture B?
In culture B, nobody cares. Financial records are taped to the village notice board. It's considered public data, as mundane as the weather report.
So if someone proposes a principle saying anyone can publish anyone else's financial data, what happens? In culture A, the citizens can reasonably reject that principle. The generic burden of humiliation and social ruin is too high.
But in culture B, no one can reasonably reject it because there is no burden. The rule changes depending on the culture, but the moral foundation, which is protecting people from reasonable burdens based on their actual social reality, is universally objective.
This is exactly how Scanlon addresses J.L. Mackey's famous moral skepticism. Mackey argued what is known as error theory. He looked at the world, saw that different cultures disagree wildly on morals, and concluded that therefore there must not be any objective moral truth. It's all just made up.
Let me put on the skeptic's hat for a second. If culture A says X is wrong and culture B says X is right, isn't Mackey correct? Doesn't the disagreement prove that morality is just an illusion we invent to keep society running?
Scanlon counters that disagreement doesn't prove there's no truth. It just proves that working out moral justification is extraordinarily difficult. It requires us to deeply understand different standpoints and social meanings.
Think about science. Just because two ancient cultures disagreed on what the stars were red, one saying they were gods, another saying they were campfires, didn't mean astronomy was an illusion. It meant the truth was complex and required rigorous observation to uncover. Morality is the same.
But if we allow cultural context and social meanings to dictate the rules, aren't we sliding down a dangerous slope? Aren't we just falling into the trap of saying anything goes as long as it's part of your culture?
This raises an important question, and it's where sloppy relativism fails. But in contractualism, anything goes is entirely false. A society cannot justify slavery or torture or the subjugation of a minority simply by shrugging and saying, hey, it's our culture. The social meaning here is that this is fine.
Because the victims get a say.
Exactly. The victims in that society, the enslaved, the tortured, the subjugated, would always have a valid, reasonable objection to the principles allowing their oppression.
The burden of being enslaved is a generic reason that violently crushes any possible justification the slaveholders could offer, no matter what the social meaning of the culture is.
Contractualism allows for flexibility in how we navigate social etiquette, privacy, and local customs, but it maintains an absolute bedrock of objective morality when it comes to fundamental harms. You cannot justify an action to a person on grounds they could reasonably reject, and no conscious being can be reasonably expected to accept their own torture or subjugation.
It provides the flexibility to respect different cultures without surrendering the ability to condemn human rights abuses. It is an incredibly sturdy framework.
Let's take a breath and look back at the monumental journey we've just taken through what we owe to each other.
It's a big journey.
We started at the absolute atomic level. We realized we aren't just meat sacks driven by blind desires. We are creatures fundamentally driven by our capacity to recognize reasons. We steer the car.
We saw that values aren't just points on a cosmic well-being scoreboard to be mindlessly maximized. They are rich, specific things to be respected, like the specific loyalty you owe to a friend, or the inherent dignity of a human life.
We learned the engine of the whole system, that an act is wrong if it violates principles others cannot reasonably reject. We learned to weigh generic reasons and standpoints, realizing that fairness doesn't mean putting on a blindfold, and it doesn't mean letting the lucky dictate the rules.
We untangled the messy web of human failure, separating moral attributability, the blame we carry for selfish attitudes, from substantive responsibility, the costs we bear for our choices. And we did it without stripping people of their basic humanity.
And we saw how promises aren't just a social game of free riding. They rely on the deep human need for assurance and the profound morality of vulnerability. When you put it all together, it proves that morality isn't just a list of arbitrary rules handed down from on high, and it isn't just a mathematical formula for maximizing dopamine.
It is an ongoing, rigorous, deeply empathetic process of justifying our lives to one another.
It is the unending pursuit of mutual recognition. It's about looking at the people around you, your friends, your neighbors, strangers across the globe, and striving to ensure that the principles you live your life by are ones they can understand and accept.
Which brings us to a final, lingering thought. Scanlon tells us near the end of the book that working out the terms of moral justification is an unending task. It's not a math equation you solve once, write the answer in a textbook, and put on a shelf.
So to you, the listener, I want to leave you with a challenge. Tomorrow, when you wake up and make a decision that affects someone else, whether it's a major career move, how you handle a conflict with your spouse, or just how you merge into traffic on your commute, don't ask yourself, did I break a rule? Don't ask yourself, Did I maximize the total global happiness?
Instead, ask yourself this: could they reasonably reject the principle I just acted on?
Think back to that medical x-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning. When it comes to how we treat each other, there is no black and white x-ray to show us the jagged line of a broken moral code. The diagnosis is much harder than that. But if you start looking at the world through the lens of reasonable rejection, you might find that while the x-ray machine is broken, you have suddenly developed a much, much deeper kind of vision.
It's a vision that demands empathy, requires rigorous thought, and forces a genuine respect for the standpoints of others. Once you see the world this way, you can't unsee it.
You really can't.
Uh.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.